Hello everyone, I welcome you all for this lecture on declarative sentences. In this short video, I will talk on what is meant by declarative sentences or assertive sentences. What are the types of declarative sentences, such as the positive declarative sentence and negative declarative sentence, and how these positive sentences can be transformed into negative sentences and negative sentences can be transformed into positive sentences. So what are the rules of their transformation? And we'll also talk about some examples of these declarative sentences and some important rules of their transformation. You could see that in transformation, sometimes the meaning of the sentence change and sometimes it does not change. Now here in the transformation of declarative sentences from positive into negative, does the meaning change or not? We'll also talk about it. In the last video, I have already talked about it, what is meant by sentence and the kinds of sentences. But here, let's talk about it in short. You know that sentence is the largest or the biggest unit of a language. It has its own complete meaning and it begins with the capital letter and it ends with the full stop or an exclamatory mark or a question mark. There are several kinds of sentences and these kinds or types of sentences are grouped into two categories. These two categories of sentences are on the basis of their function and on the basis of the number of clauses occur in the sentences. Uh, in the first group of kinds of sentences, we have four types of sentences, and these four types of sentences are on the basis of the clauses or the number of clauses or the kinds of clauses used in that sentences. And according to the clauses, there are four types of sentences, and they are simple sentence, compound sentence, complex sentence, and compound complex sentence. On the other hand, we have another types of sentences, and in this group, again we have four types of sentences, and these four types of sentences are on the basis of their function, and they are declarative sentence, interrogative sentence, imperative sentence, and exclamatory sentence. So here we'll not talk about all these kinds of sentences, but we'll only focus on the declarative sentence, and it is on the basis of their function. And how these declarative sentences or assertive sentences can be transformed from positive into negative. And also we'll talk about some rules and some examples of these kinds of sentences. The first type of sentence according to the function is declarative sentence. Declarative sentences are also called assertive sentences. These declarative or assertive sentences are used to make statements, and these statements are made in order to give information, report events, express an opinion, or make a promise. So for these purposes, these declarative or assertive sentences are used, and they have a very typical pattern, and that is subject, verb, and object. So in a declarative or assertive sentence, we have subject, verb, and an object. Here are some examples of declarative sentences. The first example is Sunil went to Pune. Now here it begins with capital letter and it ends with full stop. But if you see the purpose of this sentence, you could find that it is giving an information. It is telling us about Sunil, and the information is that Sunil went to Pune. If you see the second sentence, it rained all night. So this sentence, it is giving us a report, and it is telling us about raining, that how it was rained all night. So it reports us an event. Even if you see the third sentence, we like sweets. It is telling us about an opinion, that how we like sweets. Even the last one, I will meet you tomorrow, it is made just to make a promise, that you are promising someone that you will meet him or her tomorrow. So if you see all these four sentences, they have different purposes. They are either giving us an information, they are reporting an event, or they are expressing an opinion, or they are making a promise. And again, they all have the common pattern. They have subject, verb, and object. They are they begin with the capital letter and they end with full stop. So they all are statements. And you know that all these statements, they are made for different purposes, which are called declarative sentences. Declarative sentences can be transformed into negative sentences. You know that declarative sentences that make a positive statement, means saying that something is true, are called affirmative sentences. Here are two examples of the affirmative sentences. The first is, the show will start in an hour. And the second is, a flyover is being constructed at Gandhi Chowk. In both the examples, you could see that they are statements and they are giving us an information. The first sentence gives us an information about the show and how it will start in an hour. The second example also telling us about a flyover that is constructed at Gandhi Chowk. So both are giving us an information and they are positive statements. Therefore, they are affirmative sentences. But those sentences that make a negative statement, means saying that something is not true, are negative sentences. So you could see statements can be affirmative or negative. Statements can be positive or negative. The same earlier examples, the same earlier positive statements are converted into negative sentences. The show will start in an hour. It's a positive statement, but same statement is converted into a negative sentence. The show will not start in an hour. The second sentence, a flyover is being constructed at Gandhi Chowk. It's a positive sentence, but it is converted into a negative statement. A flyover is not being constructed at Gandhi Chowk. So in all these four sentences, you could see two are positive statements and the two sentences are the negative sentences. So these positive are converted into negative sentences by simply adding the word not. And if you see the position of the word not, it is very significant, it is very important. So affirmative sentences are changed into negative ones by adding not between the auxiliary verb and the main verb. In the first sentence, the show will not start in an hour. Now the word will is an auxiliary verb, and start is the main verb. And in between an auxiliary and the main verb, the word not is used. The same about the second sentence. A flyover is not being constructed at Gandhi Chowk. Is an auxiliary verb and being constructed is the main verb. And the word not is used between an auxiliary verb and the main verb. So by using the word not between the auxiliary verb and the main verb, we can transform declarative sentences to negative sentences or positive sentences into negative sentences. In the earlier slide, we have seen that how declarative sentences can be transformed into negative sentences, or positive sentences can be transformed into negative sentences. And the rule is that we use the word not in between the auxiliary verb and the main verb. But in the case of an affirmative sentence that has only a main verb, it becomes very difficult. So in such situations, the auxiliary verb do is used, and it is used in its appropriate tense form and in agreement with the person and number of the subject. And this is followed by not and the base form of the main verb. Here are some examples of affirmative or positive and negative sentences. How these affirmative or positive sentences without an auxiliary verb are transformed into negative sentences. The first example, the plane took off from this runway. So it's an affirmative sentence. It's a positive statement. But here you could see there is only the main verb. We could not see an auxiliary verb in the first sentence. The plane is the subject and took is the main verb. Now, if we have to transform this positive sentence into a negative sentence, we must use the word not. And you know that this not is used in between an auxiliary verb and the main verb. But here, there is no auxiliary verb. And in such cases, the auxiliary verb do is used. And you know that it is used in its appropriate tense form. Now, if you see the tense of the sentence, it is in past tense. So obviously, the auxiliary verb must be used in its past tense and it must be in agreement with the person and number of the subject. So the plane, it's a singular and the tense is the past tense. So if you use the past tense form of the verb do, then it must be the plane did and the word negative word not take off from this runway. So the auxiliary verb did is used. Why did? Because the tense of the sentence is past tense and therefore we have chosen an auxiliary verb in its past tense. And then the word not is used before the main verb. The same about the second sentence. Maria drives well. It is an affirmative sentence. It's a positive sentence. And if it is transformed into negative, we must use the word not. But again, just like earlier sentence, here also we do not have an auxiliary verb. Maria is the subject and drives is the main verb. But here we shall use the verb do. And you know that it should be used in its appropriate tense form. And if you see the tense of the sentence, Maria drives well, it is in the present tense. So we must use the auxiliary verb in its present tense. And if you see its agreement with the person and the number of the subject, Maria, it's a singular subject. Therefore, Maria does. So it's a third person singular subject. And you know that for third person singular subject, we add yes or es suffix to the verb. So therefore, Maria does, and again the word not before the main verb drive. So Maria does not drive well. And the third sentence, they like reading. Again, it is an affirmative sentence. It's a positive sentence and it can be transformed into negative by adding the word not. But again, here also we do not have an auxiliary verb. Only the main verb like is available. And you know that the negative word is used in between an auxiliary verb and the main verb. So here, if it is not an auxiliary verb, we must use the auxiliary verb do. And if you see the agreement of it with the subject, they, so it's a plural, and therefore if it is plural and it is in the present tense, we must use the verb do. So they do, again the negative word not, and the main verb like reading. So they do not like reading. It is transformed into a negative sentence. So in all these three examples, you could see that there are no auxiliary verbs, there are only the main verbs. So if there are no auxiliary verbs, we shall use the auxiliary verb do. And before using it, we must see its agreement with the subject and also in its appropriate tense. So the tense form shall be the same. And here, another important thing you should remember, that they must be used before the main verb, but after an auxiliary verb. And this auxiliary verb must be different forms of the verb do, which should be appropriate in agreement with the person and number of the subject, and also in its appropriate tense form. In the earlier examples, we have seen that how positive sentences can be transformed into negative sentences. They are transformed into negative by using the word not. But the word not is not always used in its full form. Sometimes its contracted form can be used. And the contracted form of the negative not is linked to the auxiliary verb in front of it. It is also possible to link the contracted form of the auxiliary to the subject, noun or pronoun in front of it. Here are some examples. But you should remember that the contracted forms are used commonly in informal and spoken English. Here are some examples in which you will find how the contracted form of the word not is used to the auxiliary verb and also to the subject, noun and pronoun. The first example is they aren't eating ice cream. Now the contracted form of not is linked to the auxiliary verb are. So instead of are not in its full form, the contracted form of not is used to the auxiliary or linked to the auxiliary, and therefore it is aren't. So they are not or they aren't eating ice cream. The second example is you don't understand this, do you? Now the contracted form of not is linked to the auxiliary verb do. So instead of do not in its full form, the contracted form is used, and that is don't. So you don't understand this, do you? The third sentence, we are not amused. Now here, weird not is linked to the subject, and instead of we are, it is used we are not amused. So in the earlier two examples, the contracted form or the short form of the word not is linked to the auxiliary verb, but here we are not amused. In this sentence, the contracted form of the word not is linked to the subject, and that is noun. Even in the last sentence, mother's not living tonight. So it is linked to the subject, and that is mother's. So instead of mother is not living tonight, it is used mother's not living tonight. So here there are two ways in which the contracted or the short form of the word not is used. Sometimes it is linked to the auxiliary verb, or it is also linked to the subject, which is noun or pronoun. But the meaning or the sense, it does not change. It remains same. But you should always remember that these contracted forms are used in informal and spoken English. In formal situation or in written English, we do not use the contracted forms. We use the full forms of the auxiliary verbs and also the word not. So let's sum up in short. We have seen that how uh, affirmative sentences or positive sentences can be transformed into negative sentences. They are transformed from positive into negative by adding the word not, and the word not is used in between an auxiliary verb and the main verb. If there is no auxiliary verb, we use an auxiliary verb do, and it is used in its appropriate tense form, which must have an agreement with the subject and the verb. Sometimes the contracted form of the word not is also used. It is linked either to the auxiliary verb or to the main verb. But you know that these contracted forms are used in informal situation or only in spoken English. I hope you would have enjoyed watching this video. So thank you very much for watching it. Have a nice time.